Hi, everybody. I am Mary Benton from Bound by Beauty, and I'm here with Leangie Calai, one of my colleagues. And we're lucky enough to have Xavier DeRoos, who will be presenting today. And behind the scenes, we have Hugo Sanchez of Moondesk Media, who is allowing people into the room. It's a little unfortunate that we're getting some comments, but anyway, we will just go ahead. We will ignore them. It's a lovely Saturday here in Miami, and we'd love to know where you're joining us from. If you could write in the chat. I imagine many of you are from nearby, but some of you might be from further away. We'd love to know about that. We're going to start very soon with Xavier's presentation, but we want to give people a few more minutes to join in. It is a lazy Saturday sort of day. I see somebody's here from Miami Shores, and good morning to all of those of you who are joining us. It's really lovely to have you here. We all believe so strongly in the need to do something to create a more resilient and sustainable world, and above all, to leave to our children and grandchildren a decent world. And this subject here is something that everybody can do. We'll learn lots of ways in which it can be done, how it's done, how the process works, and how important it is for the environment. It's a very significant step that people can take. I myself have a large composting operation in the backyard, thanks to having enough space and a husband who's willing to sift it and add to it and cover it and do all the things necessary to make it work. And Leangie, you've got a different setup.
Yeah, mine is much easier. You know that I am with a family of 6, 3 dogs and 2 cats. Easy has to be the word for me, and Xavier with renewables helps with that. It's a matter of picking up. We put all of our stuff in a bucket and it gets picked up, and I don't have the space for a elaborate and backyard composting system, but I do love to know more about what it, the phases that it goes through and what it's about. And so mine is a little bit more simple. I have an easier way to compost my stuff.
And that's one really lovely thing about composting. There's so many different ways you can do it. As simply as a friend of mine down the street who just piles her food scraps and then covers it with some yard trash and then adds more food scraps and then more yard trash, and before she knows it, she's got some nice rich compost underneath that she can use to fertilize her plants instead of using any nasty chemical fertilizers. So it can be as simple as that to as complicated as Xavier's operation, which is really a mass producing compost, and anywhere in between. It's something I think that everybody should try to do to get started in whatever way they can. So I think we're getting a good number of people joining us. I think we might go ahead and get started. Xavier, if you want to introduce yourself. Xavier is a man who lives and breathes sustainability, and we're very grateful at Bound by Beauty that we came to know him, and we really are inspired by his efforts to ensure. He's got a little baby boy who is absolutely adorable, and I imagine that has a great deal to do with his passion for the environment and for making it as sustainable as possible. So Xavier DeRoos of Renewable, we are turning it over to you, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Mary and Leangie. Thank you to the entire Bound by Beauty Foundation and crew. You guys are awesome. It's been a great honor to work with you, and I'm excited to share some of the news that we have about composting and kind of the process to get started. Can everybody see my screen? Is it coming through pretty clearly?
Yes.
Awesome, fantastic. So first is we're going to talk today about the ins and outs of backyard composting. There are a lot of different ways, as Mary and Leangie alluded to get the composting checkbox checked. But today we're going to specify more about just backyard composting and what you can do in your own house around your property, and then the idea of community composting as well towards the end. So let's see if we can move it forward. We're just going to kind of dive right into it. I think that I would like to start out as I'm going through this and what is composting. If you want to put in the chat, if you have composted, if you are currently composting, and maybe what your experience is with that. I don't know that I'll be able to read the chat while I'm sharing this, but I would love to go back and follow up on that in the end. So we'll start here with what is compost. And compost is the combination of organic material. So we use leaves, shredded twigs. We're going to get into a whole list of things that we can compost later. But the one that really catches people's attention and the reason that it works really well at the home level is because we can compost almost all of our food scraps. Food is something that is one of my favorite topics. I love food, but I also don't like to waste any of the resources that we've been able to bring into the house. I want to keep on our small homestead and be able to utilize for the future. So composting is when you take these ingredients and you decompose them together under specific conditions in order to get a healthy organic material that is rich in nutrients and beneficial organisms. You see on the bottom there, it says compost is not soil. It is a soil component and amendment. And that's something that's really often misunderstood about compost, is that it is a part that we add into our soil mix in order to give the plants everything that they need. By itself, if you plant a new seed or a new plant in compost directly, it's actually too nutrient rich and can burn the roots themselves. So keep that in mind. It's not soil. It just looks like soil. It looks like soil. It acts like soil, and it's good for the soil, but it is not. It starts out a lot like this with your grass clippings, your food waste in a bucket collected, and yard trimmings that we get from local arborists. And in about 30 to 60 days, it looks a lot like soil. It looks like compost. So after that, we end up putting it back on agricultural crops and food, and we're able to reap the rewards of our labor. So it's a very cool cycle that we get to be a part of, and it's a way that we can honor the food that we have been able to purchase or that we have been able to grow and keep that resource moving through the cycle. It does require a little bit of forethought, and it does require a couple of ingredients and parameters to be in check in order to get a proper compost. That includes the browns, the greens, water, and most importantly for me is oxygen. So you might have heard of the terms browns and greens. We'll go through some of those examples in the next slides, but it includes the paper products, the tree waste, cardboard, things that are primarily a carbon source. The greens, on the other hand, is something that is a nitrogen source. So the main ingredients are carbon and nitrogen, and the browns being the carbon, the greens being the nitrogens. We use those nitrogen materials to heat the pile up, to add a lot of the biological activity, and to keep the process going in the right ratio. So the ideal ratio is what we call a 30-to-1 ratio of carbon and nitrogen. We'll get into that a little bit later. I don't want you guys to get too hung up on the ratios because there's whole formulas that you can get into, but we're going to keep it easy today, and I'm going to give you some baselines that work really well for me, and then how we can kind of adjust to that and see what would work better for you if you're having issues in your backyard compost. The other ingredients there are water. Of course, we are trying to grow microorganisms, and microorganisms, just like you and I, need water, food, and oxygen. So the water is really important to keep that moisture content. Again, we aim for about 50 to 60% when we start our piles out, and we want to keep it about 40% by the time we're done. And then oxygen, again, a super important component. If you have one of the backyard tumblers, or if you've experienced composting in the past, you'll know that you have to tumble it or turn it in order to get your compost aerated. That keeps the temperatures stable, and it keeps your microorganisms that we're basically culturing very happy. So those are kind of the ingredients and the processes. Again, I wanted to talk about some of the browns and those carbon dominants. I was talking to Mary and Leangie yesterday, and the question was, what about tree mulch? That looks like it's a pretty green product for being a brown. You see that compostable products, shredded paper, cardboard, wood shavings, dry leaves, those are all brown. So the name is obvious, but tree mulch is still considered a brown because of its high content of carbon. And it's an important one. That's actually what we use with renewable, including wood shavings and cardboard, but the tree mulch makes up the majority of our bulking agent and our carbon source for a proper compost pile. So compostable products, we can talk about that a little bit. There's a lot of questions about what we can compost and what we shouldn't when it comes to the term compostable. And one thing I'd like to just point out with that is that we do partner with a company called Lean Orb. And there are a lot of other manufacturers that are focused on limiting the inclusion of an ingredient called PFAS, which is also known as a forever chemical. And it's a microplastic that ends up in a lot of stuff that still gets classified as compostable, because technically it will break down past the point where we can see it, but it is going to be forever bioaccumulating in our compost and in our soils, and then into our food, and then eventually into us. So it's important to keep that in mind, that everything that says compostable from the store is not created equally. Look for BPI certification and other certifications like Backyard Compost OK. There are a couple little signs that we can keep an eye out for that will kind of verify that we can go ahead and throw this in our backyard compost. Most of those compostable products are not backyard compost safe. Most of them are what we would consider industrial composting. So you got to be careful with that. Leangie, we have some questions. I see your hand up.
Yes, someone's asking if newspaper is considered something that you can compost.
Yeah, so absolutely. Newspaper is a great one. The only consideration when we're talking about the paper products, which is that last one, and we'll get into this in a second also, we don't want to include anything that has a waxy coating. So if it's shiny, if it looks shiny, that's not going to be something that's compostable. It has some elements and chemicals in it that are not compatible with the compost pile. So going into the greens and the nitrogen dominant ones, kelp and seaweed, grass clippings, obviously fruit and vegetables. You're going to notice that I say no stickers throughout this presentation, because if you are a backyard composter or if you're a community composter such as myself, you'll know and you'll see at the end process that any of those stickers, they do not break down. They are not compostable. They're not edible. They're not any of that stuff. They're just plastic and they're stickers, and they will end up in your finished product. So our last step as we finish our compost is to sift it, and we end up with handfuls of these little stickers because people don't actually take them off. So if you guys are going to compost for your backyard or as a part of a community composting program, super important to take those stickers off, because it saves us a lot of time and keeps our processes cleaner. Fish waste, I just didn't want to put a picture of a dead fish on there, so I put some goldfish, but you can use fish waste themselves from the dirty water, or you can use that kind of something that you would eat, right? Something like that. Coffee grounds is a great source of nitrogen. We actually pick up about 1,000 pounds of coffee grounds per week and add that to our compost mix. It's a really great source of biological activity for the compost pile. And then meat and bones. Obviously, we have lots of questions circling around the meat and bone question. Can we compost it? Can we not? And for the purpose of backyard composting, you can compost meat and bones, but you need to have some special considerations around pest management and vector control, because those meat and bones are going to attract anything that's hungry, any flies, any bugs, any larger animals like rodents or bears. We don't really live in bear country, but I see some people in Tampa and some other areas of Florida. So want to be careful with that. And we'll talk into what are the requirements for composting meat and dairy in just a second. What we do not compost is human manure, fruit and veggie stickers. Again, I'm going to mention that all over the place. Animal waste, oils, toxic materials, and coated paper. So going back to that coated paper, anything that is shiny, you don't want to throw in your compost pile. Your junk mail, you want to take the plastic envelope letters, the little plastic part where it says your name. Anything that you know is not an organic material, you want to go ahead and limit that at the beginning of your pile rather than having to wait to the end of the process. We have some more questions?
We do. It's about ashes.
About ashes.
And if they are something that you compost, are they considered brown on the compost? You know.
That's a good question on the compost scale. So we can
Yes.
take ashes. It's going to depend really what those ashes are from. So you don't want to include any wood that was pressure treated or has any herbicides or pesticides on it, because those herbicides and pesticides a lot of time make it through the process and can inhibit the bacterial microbiology that is inside the compost pile, just like it was supposed to do for the wood. That goes for the ash as well. If you're burning pieces of wood that have these petrochemicals or herbicides on them, you don't want to include that. If it's just wood and it's just ash, then yeah, go ahead, throw that in there. That goes into, there's a whole lot of science being done about biochar, you might have heard of, which is kind of like an ash product that turns into like a charcoal, adds a lot of biological homes, I would say. So the bacteria is very small. It's always looking for something that's a porous material that it can activate on and live on and grow on. So adding ash to your pile is fine, no problem. I wouldn't say that it's going to make or break your compost either way. You want to make sure that you're definitely sticking to your overall ratio of carbon and nitrogen. And yeah, and then just be sure that the ash that the wood material that you're burning is not coated in any chemicals or pesticides. So we'll move on here. And compost as a solution. So it's not just a really cool material that we can reuse and recycle. It actually has a lot of benefits when done correctly. It can reduce methane gas from food that rots in a landfill. You might not know this, but if you just go ahead and put food waste in your trash can and it goes to the landfill, they basically bury it. But that's not the end of the story there. That food waste is super high in, it releases a ton of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's about 21 times stronger over its lifetime than carbon dioxide. In the first 20 years of its life, it's actually 80 times stronger than carbon dioxide. So when we're talking about climate change and limiting the amount of carbon and greenhouse gases that are being emitted into the atmosphere, food waste is considered a massive contributor to global warming and to climate change. So if you want to put that into scale, if food waste was a country, it would be the third largest emitter behind the United States and China as a greenhouse gas. So there's some real applicable causation and cause and effect to what we're doing here. It also reduces the need for synthetic fertilizers to be used. And that's an important step that we can get into a little bit further, but the synthetic fertilizers that are being used on our agricultural fields and in our home backyard gardens, we want to limit that because the synthetic fertilizers were mined usually or harvested from nature in a non-ecologically friendly way, to say that nicely. So to limit that and instead use a resource that we can recycle is a much better alternative. It also encourages healthy plants, and those plants are able to resist disease and discourage pests. So there's some benefits to the garden, to local agriculture, and especially even at the farm scale. Compost has a lot of great benefits. And it also increases the soil's ability to retain the water that gets put on the land, whether that be from watering yourself or from just rainfall. And it holds that water in the soil where it wants to be. And it's able to then percolate down through our watershed and into our aquifers, which is where all of our water comes from in the first place. And then it also is going to increase soil biodiversity and facilitate long-term carbon storage. So when we're talking about composting as a solution to climate change, it not only is going to prevent the methane release and the carbon dioxide release from the food going to the landfill in the first place, but it also, because of the organisms that are living in the soil, they become a long-term carbon storage for carbon sequestration. So you can actually store carbon for up to hundreds of thousands of years in our composted soil. Yeah, Leangie, we have another question. I love all these questions.
Yes,
Keep them coming.
yes, the questions are great, and there are a few. So they all are related to, the process of the composting. For example, I have what ratio of compost to soil when mixing the two?
We're going to get to all of that.
Okay.
So just, yeah.
And I
tight on
want to
that.
revert because this has come up also with the inks. Are you wary of the colorful inks that are on paper?
No, it breaks down. Most of them are soy based, and the quantity of the ink to the microbiology is very, very small. It's inert, and it's not going to cause any issues. There's one thing that we talk about when we get into a thermophilic phase of the composting process, and that breaks down a lot of things that would otherwise be harmful. So, for example, if you were using hay as your feedstock for carbon, a straw or a hay that had a pesticide, or say you're using horse manure. So as another example, the chemicals and pesticides that go through the horse's system actually break down in the compost pile to become something that's completely just an inert material. So the composting process is in a way sanitizing a lot of the stuff that we wouldn't want in our home gardens otherwise.
All right. And there's another question with regards to what you can compost. And the question is, should I ever add enzymes?
To the compost pile itself, I don't think it's necessary. That depends what your end goal is. Compost is this, like, you can start with this and then you can go endlessly on this. So if there are even people that are composting specifically for one or two fungal spores for their population, for fungal spores, that they found that has a particular benefit to their particular crop. But as a whole, my general outlook on composting is to have as biodiverse of a group and collection of animals, microorganisms and fungi as possible. So if you wanted to go ahead and add enzymes or add fungal spores or add bacterial spores, you can, but I don't think it's necessary. There's a fun fact that I like to throw out for people, is that on an average healthy pile of compost, in one teaspoon, there are about 8 billion organisms in there already. So that's more than there are people on Earth, and that's just in one spoonful. So when it comes to adding more, you can. It's not going to hurt anything, and I'm sure there are benefits if you're trying to get something particular or specific, but I don't think it's necessary to go ahead and do that as a base. Are there any other questions?
There are others, but I think it relates more to what you're going to be talking about as far as the process.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, we're getting to the process soon. I just want to give everybody kind of an overview for those that might not know or know all of the benefits. So we'll move on. I won't take so long. I'm sorry. Everybody.
I'm going to hold some of these, and then once you get to that part, I'll ask these questions.
Okay. All right. So actually, referring to your question about the ratio of what we would add, this is where we would do it. So the composting process this is a very simplified version, obviously, but this is what happens is you're going to add your ingredients, the greens and the browns. Generally speaking, for a backyard compost, you're aiming for 2 or 3 to 1 of browns to greens. So there would be 2 parts. I should actually delete one of those little circles so you can see 2 to 1. 2 parts brown to 1 part nitrogen or green usually is a great place to start. For backyard composters that are trying to avoid any types of pests or pests or parasites, flies, any of those annoying vectors that might come up, you could even start with 3 to 1. And that 3 to 1 ratio is going to make sure that you are more insulated from some of that stuff. Your pile might not get as hot as quickly, and then you'll need to adjust and add more greens. But as a baseline, I say start with 3 to 1. And then if you notice that your piles are not getting hot enough, you can actually increase the amount of nitrogen. Then you're going to let it sit a while. You see there's some water being added to that process. And during this, let it sit a while, let it wait. You're actually going to be turning that or adding oxygen in a variety of different ways. We'll talk about that when we get to different methods. And that time that we're kind of talking about, again, is going to depend on your process. I think Mary or Langie, you have a friend that's just kind of piling stuff in the backyard. If you're not actively turning that pile, then that time could actually take up to a year or even 2 years to get finished compost. In an actively managed pile, it could be as little as 60 or 90 days. So that kind of depends on how much upfront work you want to put in, how much ongoing work you want to put in, and what your end goal is. If you have tons of space and not a lot of material and you don't want to do any work, you could let it kind of just do its thing. If not, you can do a more actively managed pile and get those up to, get that efficiency up to 60 or 90 days. So it really depends what you're trying to do. And then you're going to sift it, usually get the smaller stuff separated from the larger stuff, what we call overs, which is stuff that probably has not broken down all the way in the composting process. Add that to your initial your feedstock mix, and then enjoy your finished compost. So again, just kind of going back to composting. Composting is not the first and only way to divert food waste, and it's not even necessarily the most preferred. So first, we want to start with just source reduction in general. How can we make less waste? How can we prevent things from needing to be composted in the first place? If you're ending up buying 10 bananas a week and eating 2, just buy less bananas. You don't need to compost those other 8. Things like that I'm sure if you're anything like me in my household, there's always a percentage of the fruits and veggies that don't get eaten in time. And that's a feedback loop that we work through in our house that says, okay, if this is getting wasted regularly, we just don't eat that much of it, and we need to buy less. And then the next one down is to feed hungry people. For Renewable as a company, we have partnerships with nonprofits and for-profits that are dedicated to taking some of that rescued food and giving it to people that can use it while it's still usable. Then we go down to feeding animals. So we also have about 60 chickens that help pick through our compost pile. If you have chickens in the backyard, that's a great way to do that. If not, maybe you move down the list into composting. You can see that there's an industrial use, but that's something that is beyond our reach. That's something kind of like an incineration. And to be honest, I don't necessarily agree with the EPA saying that incineration or energy use is more beneficial than composting. But that's the only one that I really kind of disagree with. Sorry about that. You hear my baby in the background. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Okay, so moving forward, and let's see if I just did it. Okay. So why do we compost? We talked about some of those reasons earlier. We're going to get into just a little bit more. We want to reduce food waste, of course. Compostable materials are very heavy. The organic materials make up 40 to 75% of all of the materials that are going to the landfill. The EPA estimates that it's over 50% nationwide could be composted. So when we're talking about waste diversion, this is kind of a no-brainer. It's kind of low-hanging fruit, really, that isn't really being capitalized on and isn't really being taken advantage of. So by reducing the total solid waste tonnage, which is actually a goal for a lot of our cities and municipalities, encouraging them to get composting programs started and to go ahead and divert that food waste and organic material is very important. And it's not just food waste with that. Remember, we're using multiple ingredients. Sorry, I went a little too fast. We're using multiple ingredients. So for example, grass clippings, if they go to the landfill, every 1 pound of grass clippings creates about 2 pounds of carbon dioxide emitted to the atmosphere. So using that and capturing that into a compost has inherent beneficial properties for the environment as well. Yeah, let's go ahead, Angie. More questions?
Yes, we do. Before we get too far, can you compost so that you reduce disease such as botrytis carried on dead leaves that you are composting?
And we're going to get into that. All of these pathogen questions, all of the, basically there's thermophilic and mesophilic composting. Backyard composting is, I'm going to skip ahead, we're going to talk about it because it seems like a lot of people have this question. Backyard composting is a little bit complicated because there isn't a lot of good information about doing it correctly and why we need to do it at a scale that is going to prevent a lot of this stuff. So most backyard composts don't reach thermophilic phase. Thermophilic is the temperature above 120, I think it's 115 technically. What we aim for in order to reduce these pathogens is 131 degrees Fahrenheit. That number is key. 131 is what the Composting Council, all of the composting legislation has kind of universally accepted as the proper temperature in order to reduce these pathogens from getting transferred and kind of creating a loop within your own system. So in order to prevent diseased plants from passing that disease onto the new ones, you need to reach a 131 degrees for 15 days, unless you have an in-vessel composter, which is in that case, it's 131 degrees for 3 days. For most everybody on this call, let's stick with the 15-day minimum, reaching 131 degrees. And that's going to not only prevent any pathogens that pass from plant to plant, but also from plant to animal or from plant to us. So as we're eating these, our crops and our supply from our backyard and our garden, we want to make sure that we've reached those temperatures in order to prevent the pathogens from being passed on. Some of the more virulent diseases need to be up to 151 degrees. So again, it's better to not go ahead and put diseased plants in your compost to begin with. But if you have a diseased plant or a diseased crop and you need to recycle that nutrient, just make sure that you're reaching those temperatures. And there's a lot of information online about this pest or this parasite and what it takes to kill that off. What we're actually finding with the new science coming out is that what used to be believed was one of the most difficult pathogens to prevent were those that were passed from human manure into the cycle. And it actually turns out that temperature is a lot lower than we thought. So that's actually 121 degrees for about 10 days. And then everything that would be from a human could be composted back into a system. I don't recommend it. Like I said, it's something that we don't accept. Please don't put that in your buckets. Nobody wants to deal with it. But that is some new technology or some new science that's just recently been coming out. And it's like kind of shocking because we used to all think it was like 150 or 160 degrees. So
the other question you earlier mentioned about donating food, and I know that you work with different organizations that do take in food. I know that you're in Broward and making your way to date, but do you have any organizations that accept food donations currently?
So we work with a company called Goodr, which is Goodr, but they're working with our restaurant, with our commercial clients, because we can track that food waste better. We know that it was made fresh and we're able to get it out before we compost it. They have like a 24-hour limit. So getting that from a household level, we don't have any partners for the household level yet. I know that there are some really great organizations in Miami, like Be the Change and Food Rescue .us. I'll have to double check that. Maybe we can put that in the notes at the end, follow-up email. Let me double check that. I don't want to give any wrong information, but I believe there are some organizations that will help collect from the residential level. So.
All right, and I'll leave most of the ones that are coming in, most of the questions that are coming in are for your next segment, which deals with the phases. So I'll leave those for that moment.
Okay, awesome. And I'll go fast, like I said. So by composting, we're preventing methane emissions, reducing our carbon footprint, and sequestering carbon dioxide while building local soil. So it's helping fight climate change. Here's an important one that I think a lot of people miss the connection to, is that we're also saving aquatic ecosystems. My background is actually marine biology. I did marine biology for about 18 years. My love for the oceans and the aquatic ecosystems is ridiculous. I don't know if you can see my aquarium here. That's my reef aquarium. That's my little home ecosystem. I love them. I'm obsessed with them. I know way too much about them. So if you have any aquarium issues, let me know. But anyway, by using compost, we're actually able to directly avoid using a lot of these synthetic fertilizers and pesticides that end up degrading our soils, which is a vicious cycle, because as we degrade the soils, we lose the ability to retain that water, which means that water runs off into our waterways even more quickly and with more volume. And that takes with it all of those synthetic fertilizers and pesticides that we were putting on our land anyway. So those all go into the waterway. They create red tides, massive fish die-offs, I'm sure you've seen in the bays. And that comes from a lack of oxygen because of a cyanobacteria that absorbs a lot of the energy that's from the fertilizers. The extra nutrients in the system have to be absorbed, and those cyanobacterias and algae, they absorb too much of the oxygen in the water, and then we actually end up starving off our manatees. We end up killing our fish. We end up damaging our Florida reefs, and we lose a lot of aquatic ecosystems that we might not know about, that we might not even understand the full benefit and the full systems of at this point. So There's the obvious effects of the fish dying off, and then there's the non-obvious effects of like what else is going to happen because of these extra nutrients, pesticides, fertilizers that are being basically just dumped into our oceans because of our front yards, our backyards, and our agricultural management practices. So saving the aquatic ecosystems is something that I would really strive to connect the dots for people as to why we're actually saving our food waste. It's 2 steps maybe to take the food waste to compost to be the alternative, but it's a really important one. So just want to do that. Composting promotes soil structure and porosity, leading to less runoff, flooding, and soil loss. And to put that into perspective, this is a cool slide because 100 pounds of average soil, which is 10 feet by 1 foot by 1 foot deep, that can be amended with 1 pound of compost to hold an additional 33 pounds of water. That's about 4 extra gallons for that 10-foot strip of water, strip of soil, I'm sorry. If you take that same 100 pounds and you add 5 pounds of compost, you can now hold almost 200 pounds. So it's not just you add 1 pound, it adds 33, you add 2, it adds 33. If you do the math, that doesn't equal 200. So it actually has a accumulating benefit to the soil health, to the soil ability to retain water, and to the microbiology in those soils. Composting 10 tons of food scraps is the equivalent of not burning 974 gallons of gasoline. The cool metric here that is easy for people to process is you look at that 10 and that 9. So 9 metric tons of CO2 equivalent is what we are saving by composting 10 tons of food scraps. So 10 tons, 9 metric tons of carbon dioxide. There's about, the technical number is like 0.889. So call it 89% of what weight that you are diverting gets converted into pounds of carbon dioxide, which is pretty amazing. Miami-Dade's population is about 2.7 million people, which means we could divert almost 500,000 tons per year of organic waste, which would be the equivalent of 47 million gallons of gasoline not getting burned just in Miami-Dade County. So if you extrapolate that across the state and then around the country, it can make some really big differences. And the finished compost is used by local residents and farmers to help grow foods that help support our local food systems. If you sign up for our composting service, we pick up the bucket, and then twice a year you're eligible to receive finished compost back, so you can grow your own food, again supporting that local food system. If not, you can donate it to one of our local agricultural projects. We team up with nonprofits and local farms, community gardens, to help sustain our local food system, because we don't need to be shipping things from around the world when we can grow them right here in our backyard. It's also super easy to start, and composting is one of the easiest things that we can do on a daily basis that's going to improve our local community, our soils, and our environment. So it's really a win-win-win, and it's super, super simple. So you're also going to get less pests, less odors. We're going to talk about this bottom bullet point. The compost bins and piles are sealed to prevent smells and pests. And what does that mean to be sealed? It's not just a physical barrier, because we don't want cockroaches. My wife hates cockroaches. I don't want them either. I don't want rats. I don't want any of that stuff. So composting done properly doesn't have a lot of those issues that you might have associated with it in the past. So now we get to the concepts of composting. Sorry, and thank you for everyone for your patience and that little intro. I think it's really important to start with the baseline facts. So some of these concepts that we want to talk about: biomass. Biomass is how much material we have in our composting system in order to get the process started and keep it going. Feedstocks are, you might have heard me mention earlier, those are what we're using for our carbons and for our nitrogens. That's what we're feeding the feedstocks, that they're feedstocks. So the PFRP is the process to further reduce pathogens. And that is the number of the 131 degrees that I alluded to earlier. That's how we can know what are the best management practices in order to keep our compost pile healthy and safe for use. Aerobic versus anaerobic composting versus landfilling. So these are some terms. Aerobic means it's done with the presence of oxygen, and anaerobic means it's done without the presence of oxygen. Aerobic is what we're aiming for in composting. If you have anaerobic composting, you're going to still create methane, and you're going to have a stinky, gross pile. Almost universally, if you have a stinky, gross pile, that means part of your compost pile is anaerobic. if it's an aerobic process, it shouldn't smell. It smells kind of like earth otherwise. So, and then sealed. What we do with sealed and what we mean by that is that as we're composting, we don't want any of our food scraps to ever be exposed. If you can see it, everybody else can see it. Not everybody, I'm talking about animals and pests and rodents. Everyone else can see and smell it. So they will come because they can see it. So what we do is we take a finished compost or a more finished compost and cover our piles with 3 to 6 inches of a more finished compost that makes it very unattractive for anything, flies, bugs, rodents, any of those, what we call vectors. We want to make sure that everything is covered and nice and managed. And then we also want to talk about thermophilic and mesophilic. And thermophilic, I think we talked about, we kind of skipped ahead on some of this stuff with the questions, but the thermophilic versus mesophilic, being that above 110 or below 110, I think it's 115. To be honest with you, our piles get so hot so fast that the 110, 115 is not an issue because we hit 150 or 160. And if we don't manage it, it'll go 170, even higher than that. So mesophilic and thermophilic is something for a backyard composter that's very important. And I highly recommend that if you are going to compost, invest the $25 on a long stem, 15, 18, 20 inch thermometer. They're pretty available on Amazon. I like the company called RioTemp. They make good products and they're relatively affordable. Before we move on, looks like we have some more questions.
Yeah, it looks like you struck a nerve when you talked about vermin.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure I did.
Okay, so one of the questions is that they have some cockroaches in their bin, but they want to know if they help aerate the pile.
They do. They're just ugly. All of those little millipedes and centipedes and cockroaches and beetles, all of that stuff is beneficial to a composting process in moderation. Everything in moderation, right? We use that term universally across life because it's true. So you want all that biodiversity to be present, but you don't want to be overloaded by it. You don't want a family of cockroaches living in your pile because that means that you have way too much exposed food. If I see one cockroach throughout my 100 cubic yards of composting, and no big deal. But if you have a group of cockroaches living in there, then that means your pile is not being managed well. And that means that there's some troubleshooting that you need to go through. And we can discuss that as we go.
The other question is about does it help to use red worms to the brown and green materials?
Does it help to use red worms? I missed the last part of
that. It says, does it help to use red worms to my brown and green materials?
Yeah, so my thing with worms is that worms are great, but they will die at thermophilic temperatures. So if you're going to have worms in your pile, you need to have them in your finished compost pile or after it's been curing, and they won't survive 80 degrees or higher. They're going to start having a hard time. So if the inside of your compost pile is 100 still, you don't want to add your worms because they're not going to have a good time at all. The way that we compost and the way that I was composting in my backyard before we started it as a company, worms are just kind of ever present. They end up in the bins when they feel like it's the good place for them to be, especially if your bin is on the ground, which most bins are going to have some access to the ground, and worms are they're opportunistic, so they'll end up in there. They're like, oh, that's some great stuff, let me be there. If you're kind of monoculturing worms, if you're doing a vermicompost, then there are other restrictions that you need to abide by. There's limitations on how much citrus you can put in. There's limitations on how much temperature they can handle, how much, a lot of things actually. they have some strong limitations. The way that I view that is like, that's kind of like growing a pet, and if you're going to have a monoculture compost bin of worms, and if you're really just trying to grow worms, then you're not really composting as much as you are like growing worms. And there's additional benefits to that, but that's not just the idea of taking organic matter and breaking it down, using it, because it's, again, you're not going to reach those thermophilic temperatures. You're not going to have that prevention against pathogens. So All of these these terms here, the biomass, the feedstocks, the PFRPs, the anaerobic versus aerobic, and the mesophilic and thermophilic, those are big concepts, because if you choose to go too far to one side or the other, you can skip out on a lot of these other things. So for instance, if you're having worms, you're not going to reach thermophilic, and then you're not going to reach that PFRP. So, and the other one that I skipped over a little bit is the biomass. Let me go here. This is the thermophilic phase. This is kind of this is what we're looking for in a system of composting. We start with our composting pile. We go through this initiation phase where the temperature shoots up rapidly to that 110 degrees. And then you enter this thermophilic phase. In order to get to the thermophilic phase, and one thing that backyard composters are not being drilled into enough about is reaching your biomass. So in order to do that, you need what's estimated to be 27 cubic feet. So 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, 3, 3, 3. That's the minimum size of a compost bin in order to reach these thermophilic temperatures throughout the process. If you have less material than that, you're really going to have a hard time getting into the thermophilic temperatures. And if you have a hard time getting into the thermophilic temperatures, you're not going to kill the pathogens, and then you can have a messy pathogen-filled compost at the end. You're not really reaching those temperatures. So being cognizant of that and using those size guidelines and the biomass and the PFRPs and the thermophilic temperatures as a guideline to know that you're managing your pile correctly.
Xavier, talk to us about, since we're now in the nitty gritty. There's a question about water. Specifically, it says, to manage the heat over 150, do you add water or browns to slow it down?
No, so that's a great question, actually, and something that people think, okay, it's hot, let me cool it down because it's like fire. That's not actually true. What you want to do at that point is you want to add oxygen, and oxygen is what's happening. So as you're getting into this thermophilic phase, the mesophilic organisms start to die off. The thermophilic organisms become the primary decomposers. I can't speak today. Sorry, guys. They become the primary decomposers, and then it goes back down into the mesophiles again. You can see that down there. Water is not the answer. You want to make your water happen at the beginning of the process. So what we say is when we're starting a pile, we add enough water so that when you squeeze it, it has the consistency of a damp sponge. That's about 50 to 60% moisture content. So if you squeeze it and it holds together, but it's not dripping, then you're at a good temperature. The max of the amount of water and liquid that I use for the grip test is that you should have 1 or 2 drops of water that kind of will go down your arm. You don't want it to just drip out of your compost. That means it's too wet. And then you would probably want to increase the oxygen to help divert some of that and evaporate some of it. But again, when the temperatures get hot, you turn the pile or you add oxygen. That's what you need to be doing regularly for these composting processes to work well. I don't have a slide in here, but there's some very compelling evidence that shows that mixing daily is almost the minimum of what we're going to need to do. It actually shows that about 30 minutes after we turn a pile, even at the industrial scale where you have these massive, and I'm talking 30-foot tall, 20-foot wide windrow turners that are basically just blenders that go down the windrows, which is a long pile, and they turn it up. After half an hour, most of that oxygen has already been consumed by those 8 billion organisms per spoonful. So that oxygen level starts to decline, the temperatures start to rise because there's not enough oxygen in there, and then the process needs to be done again. So going into this, methods of backyard composting, I think this is what everyone's been waiting for. Before we do, let's get some questions.
Yeah, so is it safe to say that if you're doing backyard composting, you have to turn that pile every day?
At least in the active phase, it's preferred. I would say the minimum is going to be every other day. Otherwise, you're going to start running into some anaerobic conditions. The easy way, again, one of the easiest ways to do that is to have a long stem thermometer that you monitor the temperature of your compost. If you see that the temperatures are getting high, you have to turn it. That's it. It's a pretty easy causation, correlation type thing. So you need to make sure that you're managing your oxygen levels, your moisture content, and the biomass. So that brings us to tumblers. I wish that we could do a show of hands of how many people have backyard tumblers, because I hate them. I know that that's super aggressive, but I really think that they've been completely like missold to people. And I started out with a backyard tumbler. And then when we talk about that very first concept of biomass, you realize, wait a second, that is not 27 cubic feet. So how am I going to ever reach these thermophilic temperatures, let alone if you have one that's on the right side or the left side here. I did that backwards, right side or left side. You can see that there's actually two separate containers in there, two separate dividers and two separate biomasses that are going to need to each be 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, or 27 cubic feet, or 1 cubic yard, easy enough to keep it like that, 1 cubic yard, in order to reach those temperatures. So I really recommend that people don't do the tumbler system. I've heard a lot of people that end up with just kind of this real subpar compost, or one that takes a very long time to break down, that usually is not going to ever have reached those thermophilic temperatures to reach pathogen reduction. So if you have a tumbler, I'd love to hear your experiences. You might get something that looks a lot like compost, but I'd be curious to know if most of you guys are reaching those temperatures. Yeah, Leonji.
Yes, you mentioned earlier the thermometers, and you said that RioTemp, I believe, is one of the places that you trust. Is there something that you can recommend for people that are looking to use, not necessarily tumblers, because I know that, but is there something else? Or I know that you're going to get to some ideas of what you propose, right? There we go.
How's that?
Fantastic. But I'm wondering, for people that will not be able to build something like that, is there another way to do it?
Not really.
You know,
to be honest
is
with
there
you.
something?
So we're gonna get into this really quick. So the 3-bin system is what I think that you're gonna need in order to reach a proper composting system and setup. That's because you have bin 1 that you're adding your material to, that then gets transferred after you have the full biomass and it starts to reach those temperatures. Because like, as you can see, what this guy has started with is not going to be 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. Pallet bins are a great resource, actually. Let me just point that out. Usually you can find them free or very cheap. They happen to be almost exactly a cubic yard. They're a little bit bigger, like almost 4 by 4 by 4. Depends how you stack them. One size is longer and one is shorter. But pallet bins are a great way for somebody to start composting in their backyard. They are readily available, standard sizes. The construction is super simple, and they can be modified and adjusted to your liking. Like you can see the one on the right has a roof over it, which is something that I'd recommend as well to maintain your humidity, your moisture content where you want it, rather than letting the South Florida rain that can come in droves kind of drown out your compost. So you want to make sure that the compost doesn't get too wet also. So I recommend everyone that is going to do a backyard compost to get a 3-bin system. It doesn't need to be pallets. It can also be these geo bins. And these geo bins are actually, those were my first 3-bin system. I think they're $45 on Amazon. They are made out of plastic, which I don't love, but they hold up very well in the conditions that composting is, which is super hot, super wet. And you're usually using like pretty aggressive turning methods with a shovel or otherwise. So they hold up really well to that. And they can also be positioned randomly throughout your yard or as you have space. The other cool thing about them is that you might notice there's actually a little Rio temperature probe right there. That's a thermometer. And then if you notice here, these clamps make it so that you can adjust the size of your bin as your bin is growing. And that's a cool feature, because if you wanted to have a smaller bin, a smaller pile set up, you can do that. You can just kind of close them over each other and adjust with the pins that way. Yeah, go ahead.
The question is, can these bins be in the shade?
Yes. So I get a lot of questions actually about oh, you guys must have it so easy composting in South Florida because it's already hot. Or oh, I can't do it because I live in this state that's cold. That's not true at all. The shade, the sun, the temperature almost has nothing to do with the composting process. We have composters that are composting at small and large scales in Alaska throughout the year. We have composters that are in Hawaii. We have composters that are in the desert. We have composters that are in wetlands and redlands. It doesn't matter. If the temperature is 20 degrees outside, your compost pile is still going to be 140 degrees. It won't matter. You might get snow up on the top of your pile after that bio layer, but the inside of your pile will still be hot. And that's because the microbial activity is what's causing that temperature to maintain that. It has almost nothing to do with the ambient temperature. So the shade, the sun, doesn't matter. The only difference between shade and sun is, in my experience, that sometimes you'll get more sprouts or weeds that end up in a sunny compost pile rather than a shady one. But again, as you're turning the pile consistently and moving that material from the outside to the inside and the inside to the outside, all of those seeds are going to die because they're going to be at the thermophilic phase and they won't reproduce after that. So if you see that you're having, this is something that's really common, is that you'll be like, oh my gosh, my compost is doing so well. I have all these mango and avocados that are sprouting. And I'm like, that's cool. I mean, that means you have nutrients for sure, but that also means that you didn't reach those thermophilic phases. Because when we get our compost and we find an avocado pit, you can take it with your fingers and just crush it into dust because it's already reached those temperatures. It's completely inert. It is not going to sprout at that point. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Yeah, Leangie.
Xavier, the pots that you have next to the geo bins, is that the layer that you put on top to prevent vermin from coming in?
Those pots are actually just a carbon feedstock. And that's something that I would really, that's a great question. I was about to emphasize that. If you notice these little pots here that are full of what looks like wood chips and sawdust, those are going to be your feedstocks. And you have to, if you're going to backyard compost, you have to pile up your feedstocks of carbons because the nutrients, I'm sorry, the nitrogen components, let me say that sentence again. You have to pile up a supply of carbon because we are always creating more nitrogen with our food scraps. And you'll very, very quickly realize that you're going to run out of browns. And then you'll keep adding your nitrogens, your greens, your food scraps or whatever, and you'll have a stinky pile. So I highly recommend everyone that's going to compost. What we do is, you see there's actually 4 bins here. One of those bins would usually be full of just dry leaves or just wood chips or just wood shavings, something like that, that we always know, like, okay, we're good. We're going to be covered on that. And now at the scale that we're going, we get, 30 or 40 yards of mulch dropped at a time. And that's our carbon source so that we know when that pile's getting low, we need to re-up because you do not want to end up in a situation where you have food scraps and not enough browns to cover it up and to mix it in. Yeah, Leangie.
The last question is about our black gold at the end of the process. And basically the question is how it can be stored and how long you can use it, how long you can have it and, the best way to store it, how long you can have it.
The best way to store it is covered. You don't want any more introductions of weed seeds at that point because it's already gone through the thermophilic phase and then it's going to sit there and it's going to be this really awesome resource. So we cover it with a tarp. That way it just makes sure that anything blowing in the wind, any birds that come by and poop don't put seeds in our compost or poop for that matter. And it makes sure that it's not going to get rained on and washed out. But in regards to the time, the longer that you let that finished compost sit, the better. There's actually no limitations on how long you can let that sit because what ends up happening is when you have the very first instance of finished compost, it's usually bacterial dominant. That means that there's a lot of bacteria that are still present in there and not fungal dominant. So the longer that you let that compost go from a finished to a cured in that curing phase and into a cured compost, the more fungally dominant that should become. And that's a benefit. The fungi is kind of our soil's way of communicating. And transporting nutrients and information from one to another. And it's super beneficial to let that that culture cultivate in your finished compost. So the longer the better. There's no limitations to that. And the pile can just be a pile on the ground. I usually put a barrier of a tarp on the bottom to keep it separated, but you don't have to. And then a cover of tarp on top to just kind of keep it insulated and separated. But yeah, we'll let our finished compost sit for up to 2, 3, 4 months at a time. And that's all for the better. Any other questions, Angie, before we move on? We're almost done, everybody. Thank you for your patience. What are we doing on time?
No, we're good. We're good. We just wanted to give you a flag of where we are as far as time.
Yeah, I just looked at it and I talk too much is what it looks like. Okay, so we're going to go really fast. I think there's only 4 slides left. ASP composting. ASP composting is kind of the solution for a lot of people that are lazy. That's me. Composting with ASP stands for an aerated static pile. And when we're talking about oxygen levels, adding a blower to the bottom and the other version of ASP, this is like what you would do in your backyard. This is what we do at the farm. And this is basically an air blower that we would use to blow up a kid's inflatable bounce house or something like that, pumped through some PVC pipes. And throughout these PVC pipes, there are holes facing downward so that they don't get clogged up by the material. And we force air, you can see a little timer here. We force air through the pile in order to reduce the amount of labor that we have to do to turn it to introduce that oxygen. So by doing it with the pump, we can just set it to a timer. We adjust based on our measurements of temperature, humidity, moisture, and we can actually create a system that just kind of composts for us, and we let nature do its thing. The other benefit of ASP composting is that because we're not turning it as often, that fungal community starts to grow faster. So there are ways to do this, and there are ways to compost which are easier. You might not want a backyard blower turning on and off. We turn them on for about 30 seconds every 20 minutes. So 30 to 45 seconds every 20 minutes seems to be a good mix of adding oxygen that diverts, that replaces all the oxygen that was in the pile. It blows out as very small amounts of carbon dioxide in comparison to what would otherwise be produced. And then we don't have any smells, we don't have any bugs. It's pretty much, it composts way faster. So when we're talking about that 30 to 60 to 90 day turnaround time, that's when you're doing it like this and you're adding regular amounts of oxygen regularly. And then for the backyard composter that just doesn't have the time, the space, or otherwise, we do offer a compostable bucket. It's a bucket that we take and we compost for you. So you just throw all your compostable stuff in there. We have it already lined up with a bag for you, and then we'll swap it out with a clean one, and we'll do all the work for you and give you your finished compost back at the end. This is kind of what our system looks like. So it starts with the community gardens and farms creating local fresh produce that goes to your house or local restaurants for meal preparation, where they separate it or you separate it into a bucket. We pick it up and we get it back into our community composting system that continues the loop back around. So it's a little bit more about what we do and who we are. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. At Live Renewable is our social media. liverenewable.com is our website. And another cool thing that we do when we pick up your bucket, as you see over here, is this waste diversion tracking. We weigh your bucket. So we'll tell you exactly how many pounds you've diverted, how many pounds of carbon dioxide that's equivalent to, how many trees that's equivalent to planting. And we'll be able to give that all to you in kind of on your member dashboard. You just look it up on your phone and you'll be able to access all of that information. So that's all I have for you. I'm going to stick around for some more questions and answers if you guys have any. But thank you so much for being a part of this and having interest in composting. I hope that all of you will follow us on social media. If you have any questions going forward, I'm always happy to help you troubleshoot and share resources back and forth. All right, question time.
Yes. Are you wearing masks and gloves to not get fungal bacterial issues?
No. Should we? We wear gloves. I don't wear a mask. To be honest, all this stuff is, in my view, I'm like, oh, I'm boosting my immune system. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Do I recommend that you wear masks and gloves? I guess because this is being recorded, you should do that.
The next question is, does compost need to be integrated into the soil or spread on top and watered in?
Both are possible. And that's actually, thank you for the reminder, because somebody asked about that. How do you implement it? When you're making your soil mix, you want to use a 1:5 ratio. So there are other components that make the soil up. We use about 20% in a new potting mix of compost, the finished compost. And then we add our perlite, our topsoil or whatever else. And that is what makes up our soil blends. So you can do that, or you can simply top dress. And a lot of people like to do that. So if you already have stuff planted in your garden and you're just doing a routine fertilization, then you would just take some and sprinkle it about 1/4 inch on top of your garden bed and let the watering bring that down into the plants, because that nutrient will percolate through the water.
All right. And I also have, what is the ratio of dirt to compost for potted plants?
20%, 1:5. You can go a little bit higher. I've heard of people doing up to 20 or 25 or 30%. I just haven't seen a lot of, like, it's diminishing returns at that point. So you're just kind of using more compost for not really any more benefit. So I think 20% is a good ratio, where it's still easy enough to do and accomplish.
It says here, if I just have a single pile, am I doing more harm than good?
I would need to know a little bit more details about that, but a single pile is not the answer for sure, because then you're always going to be adding new materials. You're never going to get that new material past the thermophilic phase into the curing phase, because you're always going. So composting needs to be a batch process where you have one that's done, one that's being built or cure or active at the same time. And it's preferable to have 3. So you have one that's building, one that's active, and one that's curing all at the same time. And then you're not ever going to be tempted to mess with that ratio.
And the rest of the comments are to say that you're fantastic, extremely knowledgeable and helpful.
Wow.
You rock. Everybody's truly enjoying your present, or have enjoyed your presentation. So all good things.
We've learned a lot from your presentation, Xavier. We're very grateful that you're willing to share your knowledge with us. Please note that this session has been recorded. This presentation has been recorded, and we will send a follow-up email with the link to that recording, as well as maybe some ideas on names of organizations that accept food donations, for example, in Miami-Dade County. So we hope that everybody was inspired by Xavier's words, and that everybody is going to redouble their efforts to compost in whatever way they can. And remember, if you live in Broward or Miami-Dade County and you don't feel up to composting yourself, get in touch with Renewable and see if you can join their community composting program.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here and all the great questions. I'm really excited that there's 40 people on a Saturday morning that want to learn about composting. So we're growing. The movement is growing, and that's what we're here for. So I'm really thrilled, and thank you again to the Bound by Beauty group, and Mary and Leangie. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to talking with everybody. So make sure you reach out if you have questions.
Thank you. And one last thank you to the Miami Shores Community Alliance for their support of environmental education, which helped make this presentation possible in part. So thank you to them.
Awesome.